So Mark, I think I'll probably just give a bit of an overview for everyone on the services of FEFO, but actually how BSA have used them over the years. If I reflect on the last couple of years, FEFO have done everything for us, from an initial gap analysis on our systems and some bow tie risk analysis workshops to understand what critical controls we should be having in place as it fits in with our risk profile. I guess the other additional things early on in the FEFO space was they helped with some overflow resourcing where we were having some challenges in having senior safety professionals to support a lot of projects and respond to some operational needs. So Mark and the team stepped in and led that at the time, in addition to serious investigations along the time. Mark, and we've also recently done our HSE index as well, which has helped really align our safety strategy with valuable feedback from our people. Over to you, Mark.
Yeah, look, thanks, Bex. That's, it's been great working with you, and thank you, Miles, for your continued support in this space. A really important topic, and we look forward to sharing more learning in the next couple of webinars. So today's all about a bit of a recap initially, and then a real focus on checking, so that the verification in the field and the broader evaluation of critical control management programs. So just a really quick recap. Webinar 1, we spoke about really tailoring your approach based on your level of maturity, the needs of the business and the strategy, and different ways you can go about really understanding where you're at today versus where you want to be, and methods to action and improve, either through a guided workbook that we provide clients or any other means you think are important based on some of the external resources that we've been providing over the course of the last couple of weeks. As we step through the approach, we've really started to focus in rolling out a critical control management program to align with the international standards on management systems, with the view that most organisations are familiar with the approach, and it's just a great way to integrate critical control management into what you're potentially doing already. So we started off with identifying material unwanted events, and then we spoke with Adam and Terry around, well, what is a critical control based on those material unwanted events, and then we explained different methods of how to set expectations and standards with Caitlin, and in particular the 70-20-10 rule on building capability and high levels of performance. So now that I guess the foundation's set, it's and there's a level of execution, if you like. It's really, how do we check that things are going well? Here's a really good case study of an organisation that we work with that have implemented or had implemented a critical control management system, and they went through the process. They identified the material unwanted events, but they've sort of dropped the ball, if you like, on the implementation and struggled to really get traction on effective implementation. So on the screen here is just an example of a couple of material unwanted events in working at heights, or electrical isolation or electrical activity, working with electricity. And for this organisation, they chose not to set targets on volume. They wanted to make sure they were driving the right behaviour around shared learning and conversations before setting targets, because they thought that might drive the wrong behaviour. They also set some critical control effectiveness targets to better understand, well, where do we want to reach? What's our goal in terms of effectiveness? Where they fell down is, despite having identified those material unwanted events, the actual activity that was taking place based on volume was focused on first aid and more trivial matters, which wasn't really aligned with the initial intent. So I don't think there's anything wrong with checking first aid boxes and saline solution, but in terms of the level of activity and resources applied, it wasn't necessarily an area that they wanted to focus. So they were spending a lot of time, energy and resources potentially on the wrong area. From your perspective, Beck, I mean, do you have any learning or challenges in around the verification and the setting of targets?
I think on this one, I guess in my experience, what I have seen is lots of client-driven requirements where you have to be hitting the numbers of getting PPE checks or first aid checks or those sorts of things. So I think it's a balance of, certainly when you see safety professionals these days, it's really focusing on the metrics that matter, focus on the stuff that's going to actually have the biggest impact to lower consequence of that catastrophic event happening. At I guess, a point in time when we were undertaking some work at heights checklist, what we did find was that as we increased the number of working at heights checklists, we actually saw a decrease in our high potential incidents in the working at heights category. So there was a correlation. It might have been good luck, or but it actually, the numbers did speak for themselves at that point in time. Probably for you, Mark, one of the things I'm interested in understanding is, how do you, an effectiveness rate, what is that made up of? How do you get that percentage? Because it's not just, have we done 42 work at heights checklists? It's actually, what is that effectiveness score and what benefit do you get from that?
Yeah, so I tend to use the analogy of quality versus quantity, and it comes back to the performance standards that the organisation initially sets. So for some organisations, it's observations in the field, and that could be a checklist of, is the critical control effective or not? Yes, no, and an aggregation of those numbers. For other organisations, it could be some sort of automated mechanisms where there's a self-detection system that happens automatically, and it feeds into some other sort of system. So again, not a one size fits all, but usually what we promote is to try and focus on the quality of the control versus the volume of activity.
Okay.
So in terms of where to check, so this is a really important slide when we think about that, depending on your supply chain or the life cycle of your asset or project, there's going to be different levels of risk based on either a geographical location, the time of projects, or the supply chain milestone. A really good example is food safety. So in food safety, there's ISO standards on these sorts of things that talk about critical control points, and the critical control example typically used is temperature in food. So whether that's at the point of purchase or receipt or storage, or even cooking and then delivering the food, at different points along the supply chain, food temperature may need to be at different levels and need to be checked in different ways. And so, Beck, I know that you're not working in the food safety industry, but from your perspective, how does this then relate to PSA?
So I think what's important when I reflect on this approach and this slide, Mark, is actually understanding the risk profile for any new project or contract at bid or tender point. So I guess from bidding the work and understanding all of those sort of critical controls. So you price it correctly is one of the important things operationally. But then also then you can pick that up through and actually, I guess, flows through nicely through, the construction phase or mobilization phase of the project. And at those sorts of points, you can actually, from my perspective, increase checks, or that, you might actually say, well, as we're mobilizing the project, the working at heights risk is actually far more prevalent because we're using X amount of EWPs, or there's increased risk because there's more people. You can actually overlay then, I guess, the numbers and your focus areas at different phases of the project, as it relates to when that risk really does come to fruition, or when the likelihood is increased.
Yeah, great. And look, another really good example there, Beck, is even the calendar period. So depending on the seasonal impact of your organisation, the rush on for Christmas, how do we then focus on the critical few? So in terms of capturing and reporting on this, so this is where a lot of organisations fall down. So it is important to start with the end in mind. both, how is information going to be captured or detected in the first place? And then how are you going to report on that? So there's nothing wrong with starting small through some really effective conversations and storytelling and sharing, learning, talking about critical controls as opposed to other things that might be more of a distraction. And just looking at different mechanisms to dovetail into your existing systems. I've got to say, if we think about the last webinars that we've gone through, this whole process around checking the effectiveness of controls, particularly in the field, is probably the most exciting part for me. Working in an organisation and either as a consultant, it's just a great way to engage with stakeholders and see what's working, as opposed to getting bogged down in too much the design phase. Beck, when we spoke, BSA are on a bit of a journey of trying to capture this information. You mentioned already that volumes went up. Is there anything else you want to share around this slide?
I think probably just focusing on getting started to get, rather than, I mean, there's lots of complex systems and things that you can use out there, but actually just enacting and getting out there and doing some initial verification activity will help drive what that end state automated solution looks like. Because it does change over the period of your critical control program, what you think you want when you first start and what will work for the business, and the business will change throughout that period too. So I guess if I reflect on this one, it's actually just get started, get some data, and then evolve your project as you learn more, I guess. Yeah,
great. And some good examples of more mature organisations doing this well. They're able to use their safety software or vehicle monitoring systems to be able to capture hard braking or speeding or pressure in pipes, or whatever it might be, and using that existing information or infrastructure they have to get a better handle on what their critical controls are, not only if they're in place, but how effective they are, which is probably more important. So checking in the field. So Beck, you mentioned already that your organisation's mobilised your supervisors and different workers in the field to check on critical controls. What was your experience here?
I think there's a balance with this one. It always is with your safety resources, getting bogged down in doing the critical control checks and balancing that with actually the end state, which is operationally led. You've got your supervisors out there just looking at the things that matter, which is really the ultimate, I think, for any business, is that that's what you're doing. So I think there's a balance between piloting and having safety resources who actually intimately understand the critical control programs and actually educating and bringing people along for the journey. But being visible is really the starting point. Yeah,
and look, apart from being visible, or in addition to being visible, the other challenges many organisations face is how to actually conduct a verification check in the field effectively. So what we've got here, and hopefully it works, is Annette Gray. So Annette used to be on our advisory board and is a leadership coach, and she'll talk a little bit about her approach on coaching and obtaining feedback as it relates to, in this circumstance, related to the health and safety index. But if we apply the same principles of critical control checks, the learning is still very similar.
I'm a leadership coach and I have been for about 20 years now, and most of the last 20 years has actually been training leaders to use a coaching approach in how they have conversations. I think the benefit of feedback, it gives a snapshot of what's happening here and now in the organisation, and to be able to work with those results. So it's hard data really about what's going on. So the main principles behind solution focus is find what's working and do more of it. Using this approach has this lens, rather than being problem focused around what's not working, let's have a look at the results and find out what is working that can be built upon. because the fastest change happens from building on what's working.
So a super powerful message from Annette, and I've learned a lot from Annette in terms of how we provide feedback as an organisation, either be it related to the health and safety index or just general performance, and also one-on-one conversations. So this diagram here that talks about different mechanisms to obtain and work with individuals in providing feedback, just trying to find that balance between acknowledging the past and things that might be challenging, but then being solution focused. So asking questions around the future, around what's working, where do you want to go, what are some of your challenges, acknowledging that, what will you do more or differently, with the view of trying to focus on the positives as opposed to getting bogged down on what's not working. Beck, I know that you've participated in some of Annette's coaching. I mean, do you have any thoughts around either that experience or how this principle then applied to critical control coaching in the field?
Yeah, I think one of the opportunities here is actually identifying and understanding what the challenges are and acknowledging those, but not getting too bogged down in actually the why and the how and the history. And don't you understand, the last 5 years we've had this and we've been asking for this, not getting too bogged down in those, but focusing, I think like Annette said, on what's working well. But, I think in addition to that is really having those positive conversations, but also being comfortable in the uncomfortable conversations where actually something's not working, and you have to workshop that control through with that person on site and actually get that feedback the other way, rather than getting that feedback of this control was not in place, therefore your behaviors meant that's a negative. So I think it's actually being probably a bit bold and confident to be able to flag those issues that are just not working. Why isn't your fall arrest system working? All of those sorts of things, and actually getting into the detail of why things aren't working, but being comfortable enough to and sometimes brave, because it's people aren't used to those sorts of conversations, and that moves away, I think, from this whole tick and flick approach, rather than actually just having positive conversations about what's working, what's not working, and actually having those conversations in a critical control check or framework that's actually going to be the metrics that matter, that do help save and save people's lives, but also reduce harm to your people across your business, is sort of my thought. You've got to be brave and raise those things.
And that's a really good segue back into moving from capturing data in the field and now reporting or escalating that in a way that could be used then to evaluate the broader program. So if we think about some of the principles that we spoke about in the past, is really understanding where you're at on the maturity curve, where you are today and where you want to be. And as you start looking at different mechanisms to capture and then report information, making sure it suits your organisation. I have seen organisations where the amount of administration to implement these programs outweighs some of the benefits. So you don't want to get in that situation where you're actually making things worse rather than better, as that unintended consequences of not really tailoring a system to meet the organisation need.
I think, Mark, too, it's important along the way when you're developing your critical controls is keeping them succinct and not having 25 critical controls, and whether they're indirect or direct controls to minimising that catastrophic event is really important, because then your data does get very overwhelming when you're trying to look at it and slice and dice it in different ways.
Yeah, true. And we also spoke about that same principle around what's material. So to your point, Beck, around understanding what's critical to potentially a broad range of stakeholders is going to be important.
Yeah.
This is a bit of a slide that I guess helps depict a bit of a story around evaluating the effectiveness of programs. So based on the critical control effectiveness, I guess the other thing to be mindful of is that often there's a bit of an approach where, despite just focusing on 3 or 4 things, the secondary consequence of rolling out these programs is you can actually see benefits in other areas. So the picture on the slide is a real life example where I did some work in Manus Island, where we actually had the frontline supervisors reporting on how their critical control management program was performing and sharing stories as a group. So the secondary outcome of that is that apart from focusing on the critical controls, there is much greater levels of engagement, better teamwork, and all those other outcomes of having really effective conversations and engaging teams.
I think, Mark, too, on this slide, it's one of the things, if I reflect on it too, is when you start to implement these sorts of things, you've got to be comfortable in having red dots on there, and that helps guide the conversations, particularly to senior executives and boards. They've got to be comfortable in, and I think there sometimes can be this balance of pressure to actually make that green. Well, actually, there's going to be a heap of work to go into actually now, I guess, influence that over to a green. So, you know, at inception, being really uncomfortable that there's stuff that you've got to work on.
Yeah, look, absolutely. And it comes down to, or can come back to the organisational strategy and where you want to be. So, you know, if the strategy is to improve shared learning or better conversations, it's less about the data and more around the conversations and the stories that I have.
Yeah.
So this is another case study, to your point, Becca, around being comfortable with things that are red and not green. If it's always green, you've got to raise some alarm bells around, you know, how are we actually going to improve if everything's always perfect? This is a real life example where I was working with an organisation. This was a management report. So an effectiveness score on both the volume and the quality of critical controls. And month on month, it was pretty similar. By digging a little bit deeper, what we determined was that what they were actually checking were things like first aid boxes and PPE that wasn't necessarily aligned with what they intended to do. And that the people weren't going out into the field to check that. So what they were getting was a bit of a false perception of what was reality. So in shifting the dial, being comfortable with scores that weren't necessarily perfect, despite the scorecard looking very red, over time, what we actually saw was a reduction in safety violations with an increase in critical control checks, and also a reduction in high potential impact, or as Beck alluded to in her organisation, they called them high potential incidents, as well as a reduction in safety violation breaches. So Beck, I'm not sure if this is exactly what happened in BSA, but does this sort of picture resonate to your experience as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it is, as you start to do the work, and the automation of the reporting for me when I look at this is key, because as you know, businesses drive lean businesses and all of those sorts of things, you've got to be able to have systems to be able to capture this stuff. And that's probably one of the challenges we've had is being able to actually have that up in dashboards, and we've now progressing well through to that, which makes it makes being able to have conversations and influence at an executive and a senior management level to a point where you've got executive managers going, you know, how have we not refined this critical control program, because that's the stuff that matters. I think yeah, and absolutely being able to link it into high risk areas as well.
Yeah, and isn't it refreshing to shift the conversation and mindset from the classification of injury through to
absolutely
the quality of the control and a positive solution-focused approach. So I'm mindful of the time. We've got about 5 minutes left, so we'll have to sort of rush through the back end to be able to have time for the poll and Q&A too. So this is just a real recap really around a few pitfalls and leading practices. So opportunities are to really focus on verifying critical controls in the field as opposed to sitting behind a desk. As Annette says, ask what's working well and do more of it. One pitfall that is also very common from my experience is getting too focused on the data, with the understanding that regardless of what the data says, you're going to get potential additional benefits and offshoot benefits of having effective conversations and the indirect benefits of having a critical control management program that's working really well. As Beck said, let's focus on the critical few, don't have too many, and really be mindful of the amount of administrative burden that you potentially could create for your organisation, which may offset some of those benefits.
I think, Mark, I'll just...
So, Sarah, time for a quick poll. Yep.
I was just going to add to that one, just making sure that you don't wait for the Rolls-Royce solution and just get started is probably something I'd add to that last one, and making sure you've got the exec and board on board, for want of a better term.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And sorry, Beck, I'm sort of rushing through the back end here, but
Okay.
I think that's a really good point. Getting started, not necessarily waiting until you've got that Rolls-Royce solution sounds really critical. So, Sarah, I'll hand things over to you for the poll. And as you're doing that, I'll check some of the Q&A and chat. So the poll here today is what topics would benefit your organisation, ranging from A through to E. Hopefully you can select more than one. And they range from a verification schedule based on material unwanted events, all the way through to some sort of critical control reporting templates that you could use in the absence of having any software.
Hey, Mark, so there's a question here from Peter. Good outcomes, but how do you get managers to make time to challenge current critical controls? Has he got a magic answer for that one? Because I guess in my experience, unless you take something away and replace it with the criticals, then that's a bit tricky. And I would probably just challenge then, you know, the critical controls are there, and the word critical is because it will prevent that major unwanted event or catastrophic event, however you say it. And I do honestly have seen the outputs of focusing on the stuff that matters rather than the stuff that actually is just there to tick a box for, you know, accreditations and audits and things like that. But just focus on stuff that will make a difference to your people is how I would approach it. But, you know, Mark, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, look, I think taking stuff away, as you say, Beck's really important. What I've seen work well is actually demonstrating to teams that we can actually give you time back. So it's not necessarily adding more. Potentially, you can take stuff away. So if you can demonstrate and sell that you're actually making their life easier by focusing on the critical few, there's an opportunity, as well as apart from taking stuff away, is potentially just integrating into what they're doing already.
I think there's also a good comment here from Luke, as we're doing the critical control checks, is actually looking for improvements when you're verifying effectiveness, not just the controls that aren't there. So I think that really aligns with Annette's feedback, is actually focusing on the stuff that works too. And I think you always have to have that balance. Otherwise, you become the safety police when you're looking at this sort of stuff, and that doesn't drive the right behaviours. That doesn't, you know, directly ensure that people are home safe at the end of each day.
I'm getting a little.
So Sarah, how's the
Yeah, I'm having an error with the poll, whereas I can't share the results, and I don't know why, but Zoom's telling me it's got an error. I will say that I can see the results, and in the highest score is the critical control management reporting templates, followed by simple technology to capture on-site checks, and then skills to apply effective coaching conversations, and with only 29% verification schedules based on material unwanted events. I'll keep trying to share it, but I'm just getting an error, which might have something to do with my internet, which is appalling at the moment. So I don't know if we have any other questions. I think you've covered the chat, Rebecca.
Yep.
Yeah, the slide deck, I forgot to mention that at the start. The recording and the podcast will be available later today on that same page that you register for all the webinars. I'm just going to also share, Annette Gray's done a couple of webinars for us on finding out what works and doing more of it. So I'm going to just put that in the link as well in the chat. Hopefully I can do that with the software not working very well. And is there anything else you want to say, Mark?
Look, there was some additional resources on the slide deck, assuming that the slide deck is made available at a later stage. I think time's got the better of us today, Sarah, so those additional resources were really geared towards food safety. So hopefully everyone on the call can access the Marsh website and get those at a later stage.
Yep. Okay, so there's the webinars from Annette. One of the results that came up in that poll was the simple technology to capture on-site checks. And I don't normally do this, but I'm going to give a shameful push for our webinar next week on critical control management. We've got Josh Bryant joining us, but the Marsh team are actually going to present a game-changing digital bow tie together with critical control management and smart inspections. And Josh Bryant, who's the General Manager of People and Risk from Mitchell, will discuss the Mitchell's implementation and the dramatic results that they've achieved. So I'm just going to put a link to that webinar also in here, and also the webinar for next week for the Part 5 in the critical control management series, which is evaluating effectiveness to add value. Those links in the chat. And the Marsh webinar is here, and that's 2 webinars next week, Wednesday and Thursday. Hopefully internet is good. All right, so I think there was some great feedback in the chat, Mark, and thank you, Rebecca, for joining us today. That was great.
All right. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Mark.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Sarah. See you back.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay, bye.